Behind every closed door lies a story, some filled with love, others with secrets so dark they shatter lives. In the quiet suburbs of Texas harbored a devastating truth, one so horrifying that it ended in bloodshed. What happens when betrayal comes not from a stranger, but from the very person you love and trust the most? This is a story of love and a mother's desperate fight to protect the one thing she holds dear, her child. The Cooper family was the picture of middle-class stability in their small Texan community. April Cooper, a strong-willed woman in her late 30s, had built her life around her family. She worked tirelessly as a nurse, balancing her demanding shifts with the responsibilities of raising her 13-year-old daughter, Layla, who had been diagnosed with autism and a mild intellectual disability. Her husband, Terrence Cooper, was a police officer known for his charisma and his work protecting the community. Together, they appeared to be a perfect family. Beneath the surface, however, a storm was brewing, one that would tear their lives apart in a matter of hours. April had always prided herself on being a diligent mother. Layla's special needs required constant care and attention, which April provided with unwavering devotion. She was protective of her daughter, ensuring that Layla's world remained structured and safe. Terrence, while admired outside the home, was not as involved in Layla's well-being. His job often demanded long hours, and he frequently excused himself from the family's emotional needs, citing the stress of his work. Despite this, April tried to maintain a sense of unity, holding on to the belief that they were stronger together. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, April began noticing subtle changes in her husband's behavior. Terrence had always been outgoing, but recently his demeanor had shifted. He became more secretive, frequently stepping out to take calls or locking himself in his study for hours. When questioned, he brushed it off, claiming it was work. April wanted to believe him. After all, he was a cop, and his work often demanded confidentiality. Yet, her instincts told her something was wrong. Layla, who thrived on routine, also began acting differently. She became more withdrawn, often avoiding eye contact and isolating herself in her room. April attributed this to the challenges of adolescence and her daughter's special needs. However, as the days passed, Layla's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would flinch at sudden movements and seemed to tense up whenever Terrence was around. Alarmed, April tried to talk to her daughter, but Layla, in her own limited way, would simply shake her head and retreat further. One evening, while Terrence was at work, April decided to clean his study, a room she rarely entered. She needed to organize some papers for their taxes and figured it was as good a time as any. As she sifted through the clutter, she found an old phone tucked away in a drawer. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she powered it on. What she found left her paralyzed. The phone contained dozens of explicit photos and videos, some of which included Layla. The timestamp on the files indicated that this had been going on for months. April's hands shook as she scrolled through the horrific evidence. Her mind raced, unable to comprehend the betrayal. Terrence, the man she had trusted with her life, the father of her child, was capable of something so monstrous. Tears streamed down her face as she pieced together the puzzle of Layla's recent behavior. The guilt weighed heavily on her. How had she not seen this sooner? How had she allowed this to happen under her roof? In a daze, April put the phone back where she had found it, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to act, but the gravity of the situation left her frozen. Reporting Terrence would mean not only destroying their family, but also subjecting Layla to the trauma of an investigation. On the other hand, staying silent was unthinkable. As the hours passed, her initial shock turned into a cold, simmering rage. When Terrence came home that night, April could barely look at him. He greeted her as if nothing was wrong. April went through the motions, pretending everything was normal, but inside she was plotting. She needed time to think, to decide her next move. However, as the days turned into weeks, the weight of the secret became unbearable. She began to feel like a prisoner in her own home, trapped with a man she now saw as a monster. One night, unable to sleep, April sat alone in the living room, replaying the images she had seen on the phone in her mind. The thought of Terrence touching Layla, exploiting her vulnerability, filled her with a rage she could no longer contain. She felt like she was drowning, suffocating under the weight of her anger and helplessness. It was at that moment that something inside her snapped. April decided she needed answers. She confronted Layla in the gentle, comforting way she had always used to communicate with her daughter. With great difficulty, Layla confirmed April's worst fears. Through hurtful sentences and tearful gestures, she revealed the extent of Terrence's abuse. The details were too horrific to repeat, but they solidified April's resolve. She couldn't let this continue. Not for another day, not for another minute. Terrence, not aware of the storm brewing within his wife, went about his days as usual. He had no idea that April knew, no inkling of the fury that was building behind her calm exterior. She began to watch him closely, studying his routines and habits. Every time he smiled or laughed, it felt like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of the facade he maintained while hiding his true nature. The celebrated Dikwa. April's days became a blur, as her emotions swung between anguish and seething fury. Each interaction with Terrence felt like a charade, her forced smiles masking the storm inside her. She grew increasingly distant, avoiding Terrence when she could, but he didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he chose not to. Layla, too, retreated further into herself, her eyes dulled with fear and confusion. The home they had built together became a battleground of unspoken tension, a powder keg waiting to explode. Determined to protect Layla at all costs, April started to plan. Her mind churned with possibilities. Should she call the police? Should she gather more evidence? Or should she take matters into her own hands? Every option seemed fraught with risk. Reporting Terrence would likely expose Layla to the scrutiny of the justice system, a process April feared would re-traumatize her vulnerable daughter. Her emotions hardened one fateful evening when she overheard a conversation Terrence was having on the phone. His tone was hushed, but the words she caught chilled her to the bone. He spoke about Layla in a way no father should, his voice laced with a sickening blend of entitlement and depravity. April clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, her nails digging into the wood as she fought the urge to confront him then and there. In that moment, any lingering doubt she had about his guilt evaporated. April realized that simply exposing Terrence wouldn't be enough. She needed to ensure he could never harm Layla or anyone else again. The thought terrified her, but it also brought a sense of clarity. Her maternal instincts overpowered her fear, driving her to action. Over the next few days, she meticulously plotted her next move. She began by quietly securing her finances. She withdrew small amounts of cash from their joint account, careful not to arouse suspicion. She also made arrangements for Layla to stay with a trusted friend on the night she planned to confront Terrence. This wasn't something she wanted Layla to witness, no matter how justified it felt. April knew that once she set her plan in motion, there would be no turning back. The night finally arrived. April's heart raced as she went through her routine, her movements fast and deliberate. She served dinner as usual, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. Terrence, still unaware of her turmoil, chatted about his day, his voice grating against her fraying nerves. Layla, sensing the tension in the room, remained silent, her eyes fixed on her plate. After dinner, April sent Layla to her friend's house under the guise of a sleepover. She kissed her daughter goodbye, her heart aching with a mixture of love and regret. This was for Layla, she reminded herself. Everything she was about to do was for her. Terrence settled into his usual routine, lounging on the couch with a beer in hand as he flipped through channels. April watched him from the kitchen, her expression unreadable. She thought about the years they had spent together, the life they had built, and the man she thought she knew. It felt surreal, almost like watching a stranger inhabit her husband's body. As the hours ticked by, the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her. Doubt crept in, whispering insidious questions. What if she was wrong? What if there was another way? But the images on the phone and Layla's tearful confession silenced those doubts. There was no misunderstanding, no room for forgiveness. Terrence had stolen their daughter's innocence, and for that he had to pay. Around midnight, April made her move. She approached Terence calmly. She carried a glass of wine, which she offered to him with a small smile. He took it without hesitation, raising it in a mock toast before taking a mock sip. As he drank, April felt a surge of adrenaline. Within minutes, Terence began to feel the effects of the sedative she had slipped into his drink. His movements slowed, his speech slurred, and his confusion was evident. "What's happening?" he mumbled, his eyes struggling to focus. April watched him with a cold detachment, her mind racing as she prepared for what came next. Terence tried to stand, but his legs gave out, sending him back onto the floor. April stood over him, her hands trembling as she reached for the weapon she had hidden earlier, a small steel hammer. She hesitated for a moment, her mind flashing back to the happier times they had shared, but the memory of Layla's pain and terror steeled her resolve. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. She raised the hammer and brought it down with all her strength, the sound echoing through the silent house. Terence's groan of pain spurred her on, her strikes fueled by a decade of betrayal and rage. By the time she stopped, her arms were trembling, her breath ragged. Terence lay motionless, the man who had once been her husband, now unrecognizable. The aftermath was a blur. April cleaned herself up, her movements mechanical as she scrubbed the blood from her hands and changed her clothes. She called the police, her voice steady as she reported an incident at their home. When the officers arrived, she told them everything. She handed over the phone as evidence, her story corroborated by the horrific files it contained. The scene was chaotic as the police processed the aftermath of the grisly crime. The once peaceful suburban home was now a crime scene, its walls bearing witness to the dark secrets that had unraveled within. Yellow tape cordoned off the area as officers moved in and out, documenting evidence and collecting statements. Neighbors stood in clusters outside, their faces etched with shock and curiosity as they whispered theories about what had transpired. April sat silently in the back of the police car, her hands cuffed and resting in her lap. Her face was devoid of emotion, but inside she was so angry. She replayed the events of the night in her mind, questioning every decision she had made. Despite her resolve to protect Layla, she couldn't shake the weight of what she had done. At the station, detectives began their questioning. April recounted the months leading up to the fatal night with a calm that unnerved even the most seasoned officers. She spoke of the discovery on the phone, Layla's withdrawal, and the moment she realized Terence was abusing their daughter. She held nothing back, her voice steady as she detailed the fear and helplessness that had consumed her. The detectives listened intently, their expressions grim as they pieced together the harrowing narrative. They pressed her on the night of the murder, probing for any indication of premeditation. April admitted to planning the confrontation, but insisted her actions were driven by a desperate need to protect her daughter. It wasn't calculated, she argued. It was survival. As April spoke, forensic teams worked to corroborate her story. The files on Terence's phone painted a damning picture, leaving little doubt about his guilt. The evidence confirmed that Layla had been his victim, and the timeline aligned with April's account. Still, the brutal nature of the crime complicated matters. The law didn't easily distinguish between acts of self-defense and acts of retribution, and April's fate would ultimately rest in the hands of a jury. Meanwhile, Layla was placed in the care of Child Protective Services, a move that devastated April. Despite everything, she had hoped to shield her daughter from further trauma. The thought of Layla being questioned by strangers, forced to relive her ordeal, made April's heart ache. She feared the long-term impact on her daughter, both from the abuse and from witnessing the violent fallout. As news of the crime spread, the media descended on the small Texas town. Headlines sensationalized the story, casting April as either a heroic mother who had avenged her child or a cold-blooded killer who had taken justice into her own hands. The truth, as always, was far more complicated. Public opinion was deeply divided, with some rallying behind April and others condemning her actions. Community members began organizing rallies and petitions. Advocacy groups for victims of abuse highlighted April's case as an example of a broken system that had failed to protect Layla. They argued that April had been left with no viable options, forced to choose between allowing the abuse to continue and taking drastic action. On the other side, law enforcement officials cautioned against glorifying vigilante justice, warning that it set a dangerous precedent. In the midst of the media frenzy, April's attorney worked tirelessly to build her defense. The prosecution, however, was equally determined. They painted April as a woman consumed by rage, who had taken the law into her own hands with premeditated violence. They pointed to the methodical steps she had taken, the sedative in the wine, the weapon she had chosen, as evidence of her intent to kill. It was a case that would test the boundaries of the justice system, forcing jurors to grapple with complex questions about morality, accountability, and the limits of self-defense. As April awaited trial, she struggled to come to terms with her actions. Nights in her jail cell were sleepless, her mind haunted by memories of Terence's final moments. She couldn't decide if she felt remorse or relief. Perhaps it was a mix of both. What she knew for certain was that she would make the same choice again if it meant saving Layla. That conviction gave her strength, even as the weight of her situation threatened to crush her. Layla's recovery was slow but steady. Counseling sessions helped her begin to process the trauma, though the scars run deep. She avoided talking about her father, focusing instead on rebuilding her sense of safety and self-worth. Friends and teachers noticed a change in her demeanor, a cautious optimism that hinted at her resilience. April took comfort in the updates she received about Layla's progress, holding on to the hope that her daughter would eventually find peace. As the trial date approached, the town braced for the action that would undoubtedly follow. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager for any new developments. Advocacy groups held vigils and rallies, their chants echoing through the streets. The case had become a lightning rod for debates about justice, parenting, and the lengths to which one should go to protect a child. When April finally stepped into the courtroom, the weight of the moment was palpable. She scanned the crowd, her eyes searching for Layla. Though her daughter wasn't present, April felt her spirit like a guiding light. She straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. Her story was far from over, and she vowed to fight not just for herself, but for the daughter she had risked everything to protect. The trial was a whirlwind of emotions, evidence, and testimonies that left the courtroom heavy with tension. April sat quietly, listening as the prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded murderer, while the defense argued that she was a desperate mother pushed to her limits. Every detail of her life was scrutinized, every decision she had made dissected under the unforgiving glare of public opinion. The jurors, a diverse group of men and women, watched intently, their faces betraying little of their thoughts as they listened to each side. The defense team called upon a series of expert witnesses, including psychologists, who explained the effects of discovering her husband's heinous acts and the psychological toll on both April and Layla. They painted a picture of a mother trapped in an impossible situation, failed by a system that should have protected her daughter. They argued that the murder was not premeditated, but the result of a protective instinct that had overtaken her in the heat of the moment. The prosecution, however, was relentless. They pointed to the carefully calculated steps April had taken, the sedative in the wine, the gun she had purchased months prior. They argued that these actions proved intent, and that she could have sought help from authorities rather than resorting to violence. They emphasized that no one, not even a grieving mother, was above the law. Their star witness was a neighbor who claimed to have overheard April arguing with Terence in the days leading up to the murder, suggesting that her rage had been simmering for some time. When it was finally time for the closing arguments, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The defense attorney made an impassioned plea, urging the jury to consider the circumstances that had led to April's actions. He asked them to imagine the anguish of discovering that the person you trusted most in the world was harming your child, and the helplessness of realizing that the system had failed to protect her. He argued that April's actions, while tragic, were driven by a mother's love and an instinct to protect her daughter at all costs. April was found guilty of second-degree murder. While the jury acknowledged the mitigating circumstances, they could not ignore the premeditated nature of the crime. The sentence was significant, but not as severe as it could have been, a compromise that reflected the complexity of the case. For April, it was a bittersweet outcome. She had hoped for acquittal, but understood that her actions carried consequences she could not escape. As April was led away to begin her sentence, she carried with her a mix of regret, relief, and resolve. She had lost her freedom, but she had saved her daughter. That thought gave her strength as she faced the years ahead. Layla, now in the care of a loving foster family, continued her journey of healing. Though the scars of her past would never fully fade, she was determined to build a future free from fear and pain. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what would you have done in April's position? Do you think Layla deserved the trauma she's being through? Do you think April should have her freedom? I'll really love to hear your thoughts. If you think April did the right thing in protecting her child, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to like. But if you think Terrence should have gone ahead to abuse the child, then don't subscribe.